and it seemed to be a bit of a glitch now. So I apologize for that. But if you want to go on to your other sessions, have a little break right now, that's fine. Anyways, thank you for your patience there. And Rita, by the way, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you for a while. You look fantastic.
Thank you.
You haven't changed a bit.
Oh, no, not at all. Well, I watch for the close-ups. And
Yeah,
good to see you, Tom.
That's good to see. And I miss you playing the piano, by the way.
Oh, I've been the music person for sure. Yeah, organize the talent nights and stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, thanks for acknowledging me and thanks for all you're doing.
Okay, thank you very much. And for the other people on there, thank you very much for your patience there. And we'll try to fix this there. Unfortunately, we're all spread across the country. These things happen. Thank you very much, everybody. And I hope you enjoy your sessions that you start at 12 o'clock. If you want to take a 10-minute break now.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, Dean. How's it going? Good. So what you'll be able to do, I've got you as a co-host, so you'll be able to share your screen. When you do share your screen, at the top, there is an option to like lock your whiteboard just so nobody else writes on your screen. We saw that in another one. So just when you go to share screen with your presentation, you're going to want to just make sure that it's not you know, I don't think anyone will write on it, but you never know what happens. I know people are using all kinds of different technologies and stuff like that. So I can let you get all set up and do what you got to do. And then you've got co-host permissions. So you're good to share your screen. The session will be recorded. I'll let people in and take attendance. So don't worry about that. And we'll have some other moderators on as well to, you do what you got to do. And Dean, just let me know when you're ready and I can start letting people in there early. So we still have about 7 minutes till the next session, but whatever works for you, we can let them in and whenever you're ready. Okay. Yeah, I can just jump in and introduce you quickly, just, to let people know to mute themselves, kind of the general Zoom protocols, but and then I won't jump in unless you need something, you can flag me, but I'm just watching in the background. So I'll start admitting people and then we're good to go. Hey, Crystal, can you hear me? Crystal?
Jen, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Hold on. So, okay. So I messaged everyone in the waiting room and let them know that they will be allowed in one.
Good afternoon, everyone, if you're in the Eastern time zone. I apologize for a short delay starting. We're having storms and I had a power surge. So I am dialed in by phone for audio. If my screen freezes, that might be what's happened, but I'm going to keep talking. And then the hopes is that the screen will unfreeze at some point and we'll keep going with the slides. But I appreciate, hold on, being recorded. I appreciate you all being interested in this topic. I appreciate CACCF for inviting me to speak on this today. My name is Zach Talbott, and I'm from the southeastern United States. Originally grew up in the state of Tennessee, but have spent a great deal of time in the state of Georgia and have sort of dual residency in those two states, as well as North Carolina and Virginia. So southeastern U.S. is my home and where most of my professional experience has been. Also, why I'm passionate about this topic is I'm an individual in long-term recovery myself, and my recovery was made possible because of a medication. In addition to that, I'm a clinician. I'm a licensed social worker in the United States, alcohol and drug counselor by our ICNRC affiliate board. Also have my master's addiction counselor through the NCCAP. So I sort of straddle both sides as a person in long-term recovery as well as a clinician. I own and operate opioid treatment programs. And in the U.S., we're going to talk about that because the way it's delivered in Canada is a little different. But the aim and what patients should have access to should be the same when it comes to using medications appropriately. And I'm going to talk about that a lot because just throwing prescriptions at people who often have prescription problems is not itself a solution for many patients. They need more than that and deserve more than that. So that's who I am. I'm also the president of a national non-for-profit in the United States known as the National Alliance for Medication-Assisted Recovery, which lifts up the voices of people in recovery and seeks to destigmatize the use of medications in substance use treatment, but also hold accountable the corporations and other entities that are using the medications in a non-evidence-based way. So that's enough about me, but I'm going to get started. I'm going to try to remove some things from my screen so I can just be with you all. If I can figure out how. All right. Well, all the Zoom controls are right on top of my slides. Let's put it over here. How about that? Okay, I think this will work. Okay, so these are our basic objectives. Basically, we're going to talk about specific to opioids today, and we're going to zero in on 2 medications, although we're going to talk about 3 total that are approved for the use of opioid use disorder. Talk a little bit about the science. It's not going to be a neuroscience lecture, don't worry. I realize that the most people who are attending are likely addiction counselors or folks who are striving to become alcohol and drug counselors, which is what I am myself. So what do you need to know as you're a counselor? And then the different, how the brain impacts, how these medications impact the brain when used properly, and how they actually, what we call is they allow the brain to normalize. These medications are normalizers for the brain's biology and physiology if used appropriately. It's a lot more than just warding off withdrawals and cravings. And so we talk a lot about opioid use disorder, other substance use disorders being brain diseases. We hear it in the rooms. If you're in recovery and your recovery at all has been aided by 12-step programs, or even if you're a counselor, not in recovery, that uses 12-step facilitation as a counseling process, we hear a lot about substance use disorders being diseases. We've said it for half a century. but we can't say that out of one side of our mouth and then out of the other side of our mouth reject evidence-based treatments. And so it's a real interesting dichotomy that's developed over the years, where so often people will tell folks they're not clean if they take a medication, or that their recovery time did not start until after they had tapered from the medication, if that was something the individual was able to do. And, you know, that means nothing. None of us sit on the throne of sobriety. None of us have the right to proclaim when others are in recovery. We're going to talk a little bit about recovery a little later too, and what that term means, and the fact it's not a clinical term. It's a patient term, it's a client term that can have varying meanings. But OUD specifically, as you all may know, we're in the midst of an opioid crisis, is a brain disorder or a brain disease. Evidence-based practice, I can't really get going without focusing on this and talking about it, because in the Western world as a whole, be that the United States, Canada, even Western Europe, there's a lot of discussion about, and in the Eastern world as well, evidence-based practice, or we do evidence-based interventions, and it's an important focus. But what does it mean? Because anybody can go to PubMed in the United States. You have similar resources. You can access PubMed from Canada as well, but any of us can go and find a single study that was even published in a peer-reviewed journal and find evidence for just about anything. But that's not what evidence-based practice is. It's not picking and choosing. It's not going after a single study. It's not looking for studies that support our point of view. So what does it mean? There's one definition that CACCF put out that I think summarizes it best from my view, and they refer to it as the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of the individual patient. It means integrating individual clinical expertise, right? So it's not just your PTA group on Facebook going and finding a study on PubMed. It takes clinical expertise and integrating that with the best available external clinical evidence from systematic research, not a single study. And it has to be interpreted and applied by folks that have clinical expertise and knowledge. And when we talk about systematic research, we're talking about what has been shown to be true in study after study after study. And what is the best available external clinical evidence that we have? Are there blind, double-blinded, triple-blinded controlled clinical trials? Are there more than one? What's the best available external clinical evidence for the topic we're talking about? Has the research been systematic? In other words, replicated with the same results in more than one population or at different times? And is the person who's interpreting it, and this is what gets lost on folks the most, it seems, in this era of everything being at our fingertips, is it interpreted and applied by an individual with clinical expertise? If all those things aren't present, it's not an evidence-based practice. And even more, and equally, I should say, important to this, is that we consider the individual client or patient's values and preferences. We're going to talk a lot about evidence today when it comes around the proper use of medications to foster recovery from substance use disorders or in the treatment of substance use disorders. But if we have a patient, for example, that belong to the Christian Science faith, they don't believe in the use of medications. That's one of their values, right? And when we meet with patients and we meet with clients, it's not about our values. It's about their values, right? It's their treatment plan we develop. It's not our treatment plan. It's not our treatment goals. And when we meet patients where they are within their values, that's where all of this comes together into an evidence-based practice. So no matter how much evidence I have for the medications and their proper use, I'm going to show you today, if the patient's values are that medications aren't appropriate, or the patient's just diametrically opposed, right, to the use of medications in their treatment, then no matter how much evidence I have, no matter how much clinical expertise I have, no matter how many studies I have over the last more than half century, that's not an evidence-based practice anymore. So it's where all these things come together. And I want to start with that at the outset, right? Because it's so easy for us to go and find things and find studies and find journals that apply to our interests or that seem important to us or that match with our values or our opinions. And that's not what this field is about. That's not what helping people improve their health and wellness is about. It's about meeting them where they are within their values and then matching the best external clinical evidence from systematic research we have that correlates to or is appropriate for that individual's values and preferences. That's what an evidence-based practice is. It's more than just a slogan on a website, and it's more than finding a study or two on Google. All right, so let's zero back in a little bit more on the more specific, narrow topic that I came to talk to you all about today, medications. And so like most chronic medical conditions throughout history, we could treat addiction, in this case more specifically opioid use disorder, before we understood it. We found treatments that worked, but we didn't know why they worked. That's true throughout the history of medicine, but now we know why medications work, and more importantly, we know that addiction is a medical condition and a treatable disease. And so to be more specific, to opioid use disorder, we're talking about a chronic disease of the brain that is expressed through compulsive behavior within a social context. And so that's why it's difficult for some people, and I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute, to understand it's a disease, right? We're talking about brain chemistry at the core, and I'm going to show you a couple of brain scans, not a whole lot. I promise not to give you a neuroscience lecture, just enough to make a point. But it's a brain disorder. We see that the biology of the brain and the physiology of the brain are changed. We can see it. It's a matter of fact. This is not an opinion, y'all. Sorry, Southern will come out. Sometimes I'll say y'all. This is not an opinion. This is a matter of scientific and medical fact that has been proven. And so, but it's expressed. Those changes in the brain and the brain chemistry, what happens is we don't see what's going on in the brain. It's expressed through behavior within a social context. And that's the part we see, and that's the part that has led often to the criminalization of people with substance use disorders, while we end up throwing them in jail instead of giving them the treatment they need, et cetera. And so quite frankly, it's a biopsychosocial disorder. Some would also say biopsychosocial spiritual disorder. And I would concur with that based on the individual patient and again, their values and preferences, because spirituality and faith can be a very important and powerful tool that we should incorporate into work with clients and patients if that is part of their values and preferences. So biology, psychology, social, it's a communal thing, a social context. But why is it so hard for some people to believe that opioid use disorder is a disease, right? Why is it so hard? Well, the appearance, it's expressed by behavior, so that gives the assumption to many people, or the perception, that folks with substance use disorders, they do it to themselves. They just need to stop. Why would they continue doing that? Don't they care about their kids? Do they care about do they care about drugs more than they care about their kids? Do they care? It's expressed by behavior, but the behavior is not the problem. That's not the root cause that needs to be treated. It's misunderstood. Prejudice and racism in the United States in particular, but also in Canada, we have a history of drug policy that is embedded in systemic and historic racism and prejudice. And I could do a whole 3-hour workshop on the history around that and how a lot of prejudice and racism is what led to the criminalization of substance use disorders, or individuals with substance use disorders. Before the 20th century, right, the late 1800s, most of the people who had an opioid use disorder, as we call it today, in particular in Canada and the United States in particular, were middle-aged, upper middle class white women of Western European descent. And at that time, we treated them with respect and compassion. So we can't forget that. It's misunderstood. Oops, I went the wrong way. And that's an inherent part. And it's important for us throughout our careers to understand that and wrestle with it. As a Southern white man, it's very difficult for me to perceive and understand what it must be like for Black and Indigenous people of color and other or even women, even white women, right? Or women of color, to understand their experiences, because that's not been my experience. So it's important that I try to understand it and listen to their voices and do what I can to understand and use my voice and my position of privilege to lift their voices up. Also, victims are criminalized, right? People with substance use disorders are criminalized. Lock them up, throw away the key. Makes it difficult for us to see this as a group of people that need treatment. They're dehumanized, right? Look at that junkie at the subway. Look at that junkie at the corner down there. Ugh. They need to get those junkies out of here. Those sort of horrible pejoratives have led to us dehumanizing people with substance use disorders, especially those from lower levels of the socioeconomic classes that have less resources and that may end up homeless and other such things. Also, we have to remember the majority of people with substance use disorders have co-occurring mental health, mental disorders, be that from mild to severe, depression, anxiety, tons of trauma. But we dehumanize folks with substance use disorders. And a little thing to remember is that science has come a long way, because it was just over a little over 100 years ago that we thought psychosis was possession by demons. I'm not going to get into the demonic realm in today's presentation, but I do want to point out that today we know that a psychotic episode or psychotic break has to do with brain chemistry, and we now know what's going on in the brain and how we can stabilize that brain chemistry. So remember, we still don't know everything, right? And so, whoops, where'd I go? I went the wrong way, sorry. Trying to drive myself today. But these are the big things where we see, to think about in terms of opioid use disorder. That it's a brain disorder, but it's environmental. It has environmental impacts, social impacts, economic impacts, both in setting someone up to be vulnerable to develop an opioid use disorder, but also it has a huge economic impact on our economies. In both Canada and the United States, both countries have estimated over with a B, dollars in lost in economic damages, mostly from lost wages and incarceration of the workforce. It has the mental health implications, public health implications around crime, because remember, it's expressed through behavior. The same brain signals that come to someone with an opioid use disorder when they're in withdrawals. If you've ever seen that god-awfully stigmatizing TV show, Intervention, right, where they expose people in their most vulnerable state with substance use disorders. But, the thing before that's driving the person to go and get drugs is the avoidance of withdrawal. The same signals the brain sends for someone with an opioid use disorder going into withdrawals are the same chemical processes the brain uses if someone is starving to death. And I'm not saying in the Western world, oh, I'm starving to death. No, literally necessary for survival. If the lack of food was going to lead to your death, that sort of starving, you might steal a sandwich from the corner store, right? You might steal some money out of Granny's purse to feed yourself, to stay alive. That's the power of opioid withdrawals. And anyone that's present here today that's in recovery from an opioid use disorder knows that. They've experienced it. And so crime comes along with it. But again, that's not the root problem. So we'll never solve the public health crisis around opioids and opioid use disorder and opioid overdose. We will never solve that crisis with the criminal justice system, because it is inherently not a criminal justice issue at its core. So who is vulnerable? So it's a neurological disorder, right? So we're talking about biology and genes. We're just on the tip of the iceberg around genetic research and other such things. But biology plays an important component. Any of you that have been in the field for any length of time, you see addiction. It runs in families. You'll see generations. Some of our treatment programs, we have entire families of multiple generations, up to 3 generations, all in treatment at the same time. And that's wonderful because that's when we can break the cycle, right? But there's a biological component. There's a genetic component, which we're just beginning to understand. Doesn't mean you're for sure going to develop a substance use disorder, but it has something to do with your vulnerability. Excuse me. But then we have the environment. And it's the interaction, the constant interaction between one's biology and genetics and their environment that really leads to vulnerability, right? I have my sister, for example. We were raised in the same family, an upper class family, had all the best education, all the whatever we ever wanted, right? I developed a substance disorder. She didn't. I happened to be a gay man. And the whole coming out process in a conservative upper class family, socially conservative at the time, to not confuse with the conservative political party in Canada. I have to remember that word means different things, different places. And the rejection I felt, especially from some of the religious communities and other things, that was my environment, right? There was trauma there. And so despite having the same mama and the same daddy as my sister, she's never struggled with substance use disorders. I did. As I mentioned earlier, in long-term recovery. So you have to consider that alone, biology and genes alone, is not the only thing, but it's a part of it. And it's the interaction between the environment and the genetics and the biology that really leads to the vulnerability of who is susceptible to these diseases. And so there's no single gene for addiction and susceptibility. That's what people, you hear talk in the, in all the social media and all the things now. It seems like we get all our information from places except from evidence-based peer-reviewed journals these days. But you'll hear talk about the addiction gene. That's baloney. There's no such thing. But susceptibility to a substance use disorder, it's the result of many interacting genes. We're not going into the genetics today. Again, that's another 3-hour workshop on its own, but it's something I want to put out there. I want to plant that seed. So then each of you all, as you are committed to being lifelong learners in your development as substance use counselors or administrators of programs or addiction medicine physicians or whatever your profession is that are in this workshop today, you consider that this search for the addiction gene is not a thing, but it's the result of many interacting genes that then interact with a variety of factors in one's environment. And the environmental stuff also includes trauma, right? Most best evidence today, 2/3 or so of folks that are in treatment for substance use disorder, I think it's higher than that, right? Because we're not going to get disclosure from everyone. Roughly 2/3 have experienced significant trauma in their lives, significant trauma, loss of child, sexual assault, physical assault, chronic abuse as a child. There's trauma, underlining military trauma, right? For our servicemen and women, is a predicator for many people. And so all those environmental things interact with the genes. It's all connected. All right, so I don't know if I was live with you all today, and we can't be because of the ongoing pandemic. Although I'm putting it in the universe, 2021 is going to be the end of this pandemic. I would ask you to raise your hands. Some of you all may have seen this in Canada, maybe not as much. There used to be, when I was a kid, there was a commercial, and they would crack an egg and throw it in the frying pan and say, well, they would show the egg and say, this is your brain. And then they would throw the egg in the frying pan and say, this is your brain on drugs. Your drugs are going to fry your brain. But thankfully, since I was a child, science has come a long way in helping us understand how drugs affect the brain. And so that was your brain on drugs, or our thought of it, but here's your brain on drugs today. Promise not to give you a neuroscience lecture, so this is the only brain slide I'm going to show you, but this is an important one. And so there's a few things I want you to pay attention to. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving or not, but on this first, there's 3 brains here, right? There's a cross section cut of the brain, and there's white arrows on each one. So I want you to pay in particular attention to the red areas in this frontal part of the brain around that, but also the whole brain, but especially the frontal part. And so what we look at, and it depends on what we're measuring, but this is looking at elevated glucose metabolism. So glucose is your brain's food, right? When you break down carbohydrates especially into glucose, that's really brain food. Other things matter too, like proteins and some vitamins, but glucose metabolism is a good way for us to measure different parts of the brain and how they're functioning and how they're responding, and if their functioning is normal neurologically. And so the first brain, which if you're looking at the screen, it would be the left, the control brain. That's a, quote, normal brain. All of these brains are of a healthy young adult in their mid-20s. Same ethnic, racial backgrounds, right? Same genetic heritage. And I don't have the article right in front of me, but that's our control brain that's never used any drugs. In this case, opioids, but no drugs, healthy, no other health problems, in good shape, et cetera. That's your control brain. So that's the, quote, normal brain. The middle brain, it says opiate dependence agonist therapy. So what that is, and this was published in the Mount Sinai Journal of Medicine, if you're wondering, and my bibliography will be at the end of the presentation as well for you, is the agonist therapy. So this is a methadone, a brain that was in methadone maintenance. We would see similar scans from someone who's on buprenorphine maintenance or Suboxone. And then the third brain is opiate dependent sustained remission. So this is your abstinence-based, I'm doing air quotes, brain, 30 to 90 days rehab, followed by 90 meetings in 90 days, no medication-assisted treatment, okay? So look at and this is just the science, look at the red, okay? You see from the control brain of the normal brain to the agonist, the MAT brain, we'll call it, the medication-assisted treatment brain. There's a little more red, right? Elevated glucose metabolism slightly, but especially in the anterior cingulate gyrus here in the very middle, it's pretty close, right? Not quite, but pretty close. Then you come over here and you see in the frontal lobe of the sustained remission, the 90 meetings in 90 days brain, no MAT. See all the red? What does that tell us? This third brain here, the non-MAT brain, the brain wherein we've not utilized an appropriate and evidence-based medication to help normalize the brain chemistry. All that red, that extreme elevation in glucose metabolism, that's a brain in stress. That's a brain on the verge of relapse. And so this is one little window into, and this is not new science, folks. You'll see this particular scan, and there's many more, was published in 2000, right? I mean, this is not, but it's unfortunately not been disseminated to the workforce the way it should be. That's a policy failure from my view in both of our countries, but it is what it is. And so here I am today to bring it to you. But this is an indicator, and there's no wonder that over 90%, folks, hear me, 90% over of people who engage in non-medication assisted treatment interventions or modalities for opioid use disorder will return to use, will relapse. That's just the stats. We see it. And so there's this revolving door through residential programs that don't utilize these medications and otherwise, yet that drops down to between 10 and 20% when we appropriately use medications. And again, that's more than just the medication, but incorporating that as one part into a comprehensive treatment program. And so this is just the science. This is not my opinion. Again, these things are not about opinions. This is about us. Again, if we go back to evidence-based practice we talked about early on, is the best available evidence through systematic research through the lens of clinical expertise. That's what we're looking for today. So it's important that we look to science. So what happens in the brain? So in the 1970s, endorphins were discovered. If you've not heard about endorphins, that's the brain's own opiate system. Endorphins are morphine-like molecules. We all have them. Everyone has them, and they're an important part of living a normal life. They're important in maintaining the body's homeostasis, regulating the body's internal equilibrium by adjusting its physiological processes. And so homeostasis, if we throw back to 8th or 9th grade science class, right? And remember, that just basically means normal, that all the various chemicals in our brain and our body, what do we need? The body's ingesting things to get to normal. Endorphins are an important part of that, just like various other neurotransmitters and hormones. And so we learned that we had these endorphins, and this was discovered in the 1970s. Remember, the original methadone research was done in the 50s and 60s. And so then we learned about this because we knew that methadone, when utilized appropriately early on, and we see it now with buprenorphine as well, for those who, at least those who don't have higher tolerances and longer addiction histories, which still may need methadone, we see that we saw the medication work, but we didn't know why. Remember we talked about that earlier? This is when we start to understand why. And so endorphins are also involved in the modulation of many of the brain's systems involved in behavior. The reward system in the brain. Endorphins are sort of the neurotransmitter on the front end that ultimately can lead to the release of dopamine, which is also at play with alcohol, with stimulants and methamphetamine. That dopamine drive, a lot of you all know about that. So bottom line on here, and the important takeaway is that we all, everyone in this workshop today, every one of you, you're sitting there and you have an opioid dependent brain. Every one of us, every one of you, whether you've ever taken a synthetic opioid or a pain pill or heroin or not, you're sitting there and your normalcy, your quality of life is dependent in part, that homeostasis for that, on opioids. They're just natural opioids, your endorphins, which again are morphine-like molecules. And it's that system that's at play when we're talking about opioid use disorder or opiate addiction. So endorphins work by releasing, so what happens is, that sentence doesn't really make sense on my slide, I apologize about that. Endorphins work by releasing the endorphin, that makes no sense. So what happens is endorphins are released and they're attaching to what is called a receptor. So if you think about the endorphin, which is a neurotransmitter, so again in the brain, a neurotransmitter is just a chemical that's part of how the brain communicates. It's how the brain sends signals from one part to another. So think of those endorphins or that neurotransmitter that as keys, a bunch of little keys, right? And then there's receptor sites in the brain that the different neurotransmitters bind to. A lot of you probably know this in general. And we can think of that as like a lock, right? And so it's like a lock and a key. Endorphins are the key, receptors are the lock. They fit perfectly together. The key turns, and then all of the things we know from opioids occur. Also, but the endorphins that we had in our brain naturally, those keys, they don't turn the lock quite as far as some of the other synthetic endorphins we could say are opiates of abuse. And so the impact's not the same. And also remember that goal of homeostasis, where we sort of stay at an even keel all the time. So we don't have this rush of keys like is what happens when you use. And so dose stability during methadone and buprenorphine maintenance treatment allows the brain to begin to heal. And so what's happening in the normal brain, and I think you all can see me at least up in the corner, is that we have the endorphins that are constantly being, if you think of like your normal, your homeostasis between my thumb, let me see if I can see my picture and make sure you can actually see me. Well, where is it? Well, hopefully, good Lordy. Here we go. Yes, okay. So my thumb and this finger here, this is sort of homeostasis. And so endorphins are constantly kind of being released and dropping off and being released, but we're staying in this normal. what happens with the opioid dependent brain is the endorphins, the brain sees this constant rush of Oxycontin, of heroin, of fentanyl, of whatever your opioid of abuse is, this rush. And so you're going up out here off the screen, right? Shooting way up beyond this normal range, beyond homeostasis. And that's the high, that's the rush, that's the extra, all the things that only happen for the very first parts of opioid use, because then tolerance occurs, right? And it's a rush of keys. So the brain's like, I've got all these keys, man. I don't need as many keys. And so what happens is the brain over time will begin to decrease its production of natural endorphins, in some cases even shuts down completely. And so that's when that rush and the high ends. And so people that have been opioid dependent for long periods of time, they'll tell you, I'm not even getting high, I'm just trying to stay well. I have to have something to get out of bed. I have to have something just to feel normal, because they're not even here where everybody in this workshop is, right? They're down here. They don't even have, if they don't use the natural endorphins we all have. And so it's just miserable. And that can last for a long, long time. And so that's why we talk about acute withdrawals with opiates, and we talk about detox, right? 5 to 7 days. If it's longer acting opioids, could be 2-3 weeks of the flu-like intense acute withdrawals. But then what happens? That's not the end. We think, oh, you can get past that. And most people do and can. But then they're down here. And that's what we call post-acute withdrawal syndrome. Post-acute. And it can last for a year, 2 years. Some people will never get back up to here alone for those natural endorphins to take over in the brain to heal again. And so it's just a fancy way for saying feeling like crap for a long period of time. And that is what drives use. That is what drives that non-MAT rate to be upwards of 90%, because people just, hypersensitivity to pain, depression, low energy, anxiety, they just feel like crap because their brains have not normalized. And so methadone and buprenorphine in particular, if you think of them not as substitute drugs, because they're not, they are long acting, right? So it takes a long time after consuming them for them to build. It's also what makes methadone so dangerous on the street and why we need controls if it's used properly. Buprenorphine less so, it's less dangerous. It takes a long time to build, and then it holds throughout the day and then gradually drops off. What does that sound like? Sounds like those endorphins, doesn't it? So methadone and buprenorphine mimic the natural endorphins in our brain because of their long onset of action and their long duration. The short-acting opiates of abuse, morphine, heroin, oxycodone, Dilaudid, you pick it. You shoot up and then you shoot back down, and it's the rapid up and down. And the only time people are normal are when they're passing through on their way up or crashing back down. And that's why all the trials, long-term trials we've tried to do with short-acting opiates, you might have heard of the heroin-assisted treatment and other things they've done out in Vancouver. In the end, they just don't really work because we're still dealing with short-acting opiates. And the reason these methadone and buprenorphine have been proven to be effective when used the right way is because they mimic the natural endorphins. Makes sense. So it actually, when you're in maintenance treatment, it allows the brain to heal if the dosage is done right and the medication is taken properly. A lot of people don't realize that. The brain begins to heal because, again, you've got the, and sometimes I start preaching and forget where I am on my slides, so I apologize if that's the case. But so you need a sufficient period of time in maintenance. Remember, we have the keys, we have the locks, right? The endorphins, the receptors. So you got two sides to this, what we call endogenous opioid ligand system that are at play with opiate use disorder. And this is critical for counselors to understand this when you're working with people, because we need interventions they can work with based on where their brain is in the healing process. And so you've got two sides. And so you have the shutdown of the production of keys, right? We just talked about that. That leads to post-acute withdrawal syndrome and other things. But the literature refers to what happens to the receptor sides or the locks themselves after years of the ups and downs and the up and down and not that gradual normalcy that all of our brains need, is that the receptor sites themselves, as the literature states it, become deranged. Sometimes I'll joke with my patients when we're doing psychoeducation and tell them they have deranged brains, you know, that part of the brain, once they start to understand this, becomes deranged. And so over time, the brain will actually, talks about pulling them down in some of the literature. The brain will pare back the receptor sites that have become damaged because, again, you got all these keys flooding in and then they're dropping off, right? Part of that leads to the shutdown of the production of endorphins is also what damages the receptors, because you're going up and down, up and down. So the brain over time sees all these keys, not only shuts down endorphins, but it says, I need more locks. I need more receptors to take care of all these keys, right? So it takes more and more keys to fill the receptors. Does anybody know where we're headed? That's tolerance. More and more and more to achieve the same. That's the simplified, but that's one part of what's going on with tolerance. You just have more receptors to fill. But then what happens, because of these short-acting opiates that then crash back down, and then all of a sudden you're down below normal again, the brain says, oh, wait, 6, 8 hours later, oh, wait, I don't have any keys. So I need to remove receptors. So the brain will start to actually pare down and pull back receptors. And then what happens is they take another hit. They shoot another dope, shoot another bag of dope, whatever it is, snort another pill, boom, back up again. And the brain's like, wait, I need more receptors. No, I need less receptors. No, I need more. And so it's this chaos, the up and down, rapid cycling in and out of withdrawals to high, and never really staying in the normal. That's what damages the brain, and it damages the receptor sides, where there's like half receptors, deformed receptors. But the brain has an amazing ability to heal itself. And in the scientific world, we call that plasticity. The brain is very plastic. It has an amazing ability to heal itself. And because of that, the brain will do so in most patients, or at least heal it. It will get better than it was, even if there's someone whose brain can't heal completely. So back to methadone and buprenorphine. I'm using my hands again, if you can see my bit, is to get us back into this normal, right? Where we mimic the endorphins. When that happens, when we're on an appropriate maintenance dose, it's not about low numbers. It's not like people like, oh, we need to give them just a little bitty bit of methadone or a little bitty bit of buprenorphine. No, if you don't get them on a sufficient dose, you're not getting them into the normal range. We have to suppress all symptoms clinically, or we're keeping them down here and the brain won't heal. We've got to get them to normal, whatever that is and whatever dose amount that ends up being. There is no such thing as a high dose. There is no such thing as a low dose, scientifically or by the evidence. There is only an adequate dose for each individual patient that allows them to live a normal life. Now, you don't want somebody to have more than they need, right? But you equally don't want someone to have less than they need. Individualized treatment is key here. And then we mimic endorphins. Think of it as endorphin replacement therapy. We're giving them a synthetic version of a chemical the body needs to function normally. And then what happens during maintenance, the literature says minimum of 1 to 2 years. For most patients, they need longer. Is that the receptor side of the brain, the deranged receptors? That side heals. That's why maintenance has to go on more than just using these medicines to detox. Because when we just do a quick detox with these meds, the relapse rates are just as bad as if we had never used them, because we're not addressing the normalizing of the brain's chemistry. So if we keep them on an appropriate maintenance dose, and while we're doing that and the receptor sides are healing and the brain is normalizing, that's where the beauty of what addiction counselors do comes in. Because when we get them feeling normally, even if it takes a medication to help with that, and again, that's not about their willpower, it's not about their motivation, it's about their brain chemistry, right? And if we stabilize that, then what all of us do, our magic comes in. We can start working on the trauma that might have predisposed some of the addiction. We can start working on stable housing and recovery, a long-term recovery plan. I know there's some recovery coaching sessions in your conference this year, which is awesome, because recovery coaches and recovery support specialists, those are not clinicians, but they need to take their rightful seat as part of as a profession in our field, to do that lived experience that we can't always do as therapists or counselors because of boundary issues, important boundaries that we need to keep as clinicians. So we get to do that work. Do they have, once we've normalized the opioid system in their brain, even if they're still on a maintenance dosage of buprenorphine or methadone, after that, is there still any depression? Is there anxiety? Is there any other mental health? We get to coordinate care, make referrals, get them help for that, right? And for some people, that takes longer than others. But so that's the point of maintenance, is it's not just everyone knows, well, if methadone, it keeps them out of withdrawals and it knocks away their cravings and, but they're just going in Canada, largely you go to the pharmacy, you get a dose and, they're just trading one drug for another. Anyone that says that, or if you come away from this workshop saying that, you weren't listening or you had a closed mind, because we're not trading one drug for another. We're trading chaotic drug use, short-acting opiates that damage the brain, for a long-acting medication that, when used properly, alongside comprehensive care, counseling, and recovery support, and case management's a big thing too sometimes, allows people to get back to normal and allows their brain to heal and sets them up for long-term stability and sobriety. That's what happens. Then, for those who want to and who can, a taper can occur. After the receptor sides have healed through maintenance, we have addressed all the other comprehensive, multi-dimensional problems that tend to present with someone who has substance use disorders. But there's a lot of factors there. Are they away from drug-using friends? Do they have a stable home environment? If everybody in the house is still using drugs and we taper them down, guys, we're tapering them into relapse because, again, remember the environment from early on, how that interplays with things. But if we've been able to, and we're not always able to, right? This is textbook perfect world. If we're able to address all those other things, then we can begin to taper, but tapers have to be slow. Why? Remember the endorphins production that's shut down or gradually or greatly decreased, rather, in many of these folks? When we take away a little bit of buprenorphine or methadone, we have to then hold a little bit. The rule is no more than 10% of the total dose, and we don't decrease more often than every 3 or 4 weeks. It takes a long time. But as we take a little bit away, if you can see my hands again, up top here's the medication, and down here's the endorphins that they're not producing. We take a little bit away, we got to give it time for that natural system to take over again. And the goal with a taper that's done right is that as we remove the synthetic endorphins, we go slow enough that the brain, whose receptor sides have already healed during maintenance, right, begin to take over. And so the patient never experiences withdrawals. They don't have post-acute withdrawal syndrome either that we talked about that drives relapse, because we've gone slow enough that the natural system is able to take over again. You go and get a hip replacement, you're not getting out of the hospital and going and running a marathon the next week. Not happening. You're going to do physical therapy, you're going to do other things, and that's the same thing here. We have to slowly allow, all while working on relapse prevention and coping skills and doing the amazing work addiction counselors do. And that's what we're talking about, a biopsychosocial disorder. Let me check my time, because sometimes.
You have like 25 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So biopsychosocial disorder, I want to come back to that concept now that we've talked about this. Biology, bio. Without the medications, you leave the bio untreated. With psychological, without the good work addiction counselors do and other psychologists and behavioral professionals do, we leave the psycho part untreated. Social, without case management, recovery support, recovery coaching, and all of those things, we leave the social untreated. And so we have to be very careful today in the United States and also in Canada. There's a lot of proponents of this, quote, medication only. Want to get rid of the assisted. Now, do we want to force patients into services they don't need or don't want? No, because then That goes back to evidence-based practice that violates the patient's values and preferences. Also, we're wasting resources if they don't need it. So we have to remember everybody's different, but patients deserve access to these things, right? And so unless we have, when it comes to, and I'm speaking about opioid use disorder in particular, and there were some questions previous that I want to make sure I incorporate in that I saw on the app about some other substance use disorders. But when it comes to opioid use disorder in particular, if you don't have an evidence-based medication, addiction counseling, psychotherapy, and case management, peer recovery support, a longer term, stable housing, healthy, sober social networks. If any one of those three things is missing, you're leaving a third of this disease untreated, and the evidence shows it. The evidence shows it. The outcomes show it. But we're not talking about just throwing medication at people either, because then you just give a medication and then you're only treating a third of the disease, right? And that's so often what's happened. I know, especially in Canada, in your current model, you sort of have two ways of providing medications, wherein there are sort of clinics where a patient can get, in some provinces, I don't know, it varies, where patients can receive their medication on site and can also have access to counseling and case management and other things. And that's, now the quality of that counseling and case management also varies, right? And we see that in the United States too. Then you have another model where they go and see an addictionologist and they just go get their dose from the pharmacy. And they may or may not, in that situation, have access in every province to the other things they need. So how do addiction counselors, and that's what I would challenge you to think of from a policy perspective, is not when you see the way MAT is not done right, for that to turn you away from it, but how can you be part of the solution? Is there a way that you or your agency in your province can engage with the addiction medicine doctors and allow those patients to have access to that counseling and to that case management? That's the thing to think about, because you have a really unique model in Canada for the delivery of medication-assisted treatment, where patients just don't have access to what they do. Then we see the patients not healing, right? And then we say, well, look, that doesn't work. Look at them, they're still using, they're getting high, they're slobbering. Well, they never had access to all the other things they needed. So I would say, is it bad patient or bad treatment? I said bad treatment. Because when patients have access to what they need and deserve, 90% get better. But it's the 10% that don't that make the headlines. It's the 10% that don't that you see nodding into the potato salad at a family picnic. But that's not 90%. And we can pull 10% of addiction counselors out that, 10% of law enforcement, 10% of, well, maybe more than 10% of politicians, right? But 10% of any group. And so the well-run programs, patients that are getting on with their lives, you don't see them. They don't make headlines. But that's what, again, we have to look to evidence. And I see it because I treat them. And so that's what I would challenge you to think about, right? So we're talking about maintenance. This is not just about warding off withdrawals or giving something to somebody that just isn't strong enough to get off of opiates alone. We're talking about an evidence-based medication that treats and helps normalize an organ of the body, just like if someone's got anything else, right? We give insulin when someone's pancreas is not producing insulin naturally. We give a synthetic version so they can live a quality life. Depending on whether it's type 1 or type 2 diabetes, some people then, through lifestyle change, through exercise and dietary change, can cease insulin dependency and no longer need it. Others can't. This is no different. And it's long past time we stop treating addiction differently than we treat all the other diseases. What does the evidence show? And that for other metabolic disorders, which at its heart is what opioid use disorder is, it's typically a combination of medicine, lifestyle change, behavioral change, and things like that that are the most proven course of treatment that lead to success. But not everyone complies, right? And so should a diabetic go eat a 12 pack of donuts? We don't kick them off their treatment because of a blood sugar spike. And likewise, if someone that has a substance use disorder exhibits a symptom of their disease and has a lapse, we don't kick them out of treatment for that. It's all about the greater harm. We pick them up, we recognize the progress they've made, right, as counselors, as a way to encourage and say, look how good you did. This is a bump in the road. Pick ourselves up. Let's keep going. What can we learn from that? What coping skills could we have had that could have prevented that, right? Because when we kick them out, if you do the risk benefit, especially in this era of fentanyl and the heroin supply, to kick them out is death. To not encourage them to get access to the services they need, be that medication, if you don't have it within your agencies or whatever, can mean death. And then we cross in my view, to a whole realm of ethical problems. So remember, now I got to get my camera going. It's a metabolic disorder of the brain. It's not only because of lower endorphins. We have the receptor sides, right? Don't forget the receptors, and that's why maintenance, 1-2 years minimum, and most need more on a stable dose. So, and that 1 to 2 years minimum doesn't even start until their drug screens are showing they're not using any other drugs, right? 1 to 2 years of using a synthetic endorphin to normalize the brain, but it's not just because of lower endorphins, although that's one part of it. And that the long-term use of usually short-acting opioids seems to damage the endorphin system, and the body cannot maintain basic functions like body temperature. You'll see people in withdrawals, they freeze, right? And likewise, when people first begin maintenance treatment with methadone, buprenorphine, a lot of times they'll start burning up, right? That tends to go away because this system of the brain is involved in tons and tons of things, including immune response and other things. And that the endorphin's ability to regulate some important functions are also damaged, like immune and hormone function. And so we'll see in female patients, their menstruation cycle becomes abnormal during use. That's all of these things, okay? But remember, we're talking about giving the body a synthetic version of something that it's not producing naturally. You can also think of hormone replacement therapy when women hit menopause, right? Sort of the goal too is you end up, because suddenly these hormones that the body's been used to for what? Homeostasis, right? Normalcy. They're gone. The body's no longer making them. And it causes crazy side effects, right? That's what's happening with opioid use disorder as well, just a different organ and a different chemical, a different neurotransmitter. So what do? We do hormone replacement therapy. You maintain, you get normal, and then what do? Slowly and gradually reduce the hormones to allow your body to adjust. The difference between hormone replacement therapy and why that's not always the best example is that the body can eventually adjust to none of those hormones, whereas with endorphins, you can't really adjust to none. Other people can taper down slowly, right? We talked about slow. They might be able to come down halfway, 2/3 of the way, 3/4 of the way, and hit a wall, and then not be able to finish the taper. And that's okay too, because some people's brains will never, the damage is so severe to the system that they might be able to taper some and have natural endorphins take over most, but not all the way, if a quality of life is our measure, right? And so again, it's not about their motivation, not about their willpower, definitely not about their morality. It's about their brain chemistry. And then how can we as counselors, if you're a counselor, work on coping skills, relapse prevention, work on the wraparound. If you look at the 12 core functions of the A&D counselor, under the IC and RC, or the 4 domains, and then under the NCCAP, it's the 8 counselor skill groups, which is all the same stuff, just different ways of categorizing it, right? And you look at all those different things. One of the core functions is case management. That's part of the responsibility of the A&D counselor, and sometimes that's what they need the most. Stable housing, healthcare, treatment for other things. We're doing all that while the medications are stabilizing the brain. And we're reminding the patient and combating the stigma through therapeutic processes, through things like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Challenging those false beliefs and those cognitive distortions that they're just, they weren't strong enough to do it on their own, so they had to take a medicine. No. We're talking about what the World Health Organization has put on the list of essential medications. So this is not trading one drug for another. It's trading drug use for stability for a medication that allows the brain to heal. But despite all this information I've thrown at you, we are still unraveling this thing. And so it's a really complex medical condition, and it does take time to understand it. This is the first you've been exposed to some of this science. You're gonna have questions. You're gonna want to marinate on it. You're gonna want to think about it more. And I'm going to get a handout to Crystal, because my slides, these aren't going to be great for you, right? You can, because as you have seen, most of what I tell you, I don't put on my slides. They're a backdrop. But I'm going to put get a resource list to Crystal and Jennifer so we can get that out to you all. That'll have some good stuff on the evidence for further study for you. But advances in neuroscience have helped to move things forward. Now we know why methadone and buprenorphine work, and they are not a substitute, but a medication that normalizes a system that has been damaged by drug use. Some may say, well, what about naltrexone or Vivitrol as the long-acting injectable? It's very, very evidence-based when used with alcohol. But with opioids, remember, we're talking about the endorphin replacement and how that allows the brain to heal. Naltrexone's a blocker. So it blocks the binding. It blocks keys from going into locks. And so what Dr. Vincent Dole said, he was one of the sort of godfathers of this research, one of the men that discovered the endorphins in the 70s. What he said when asked about naltrexone for OUD in the late 80s is that if we believe the science that this is the derangement of the opiate ligand system, right, that the use of an antagonist like naltrexone for opioid use disorder, now hear me, not alcohol use disorder, where it's very evidence-based in its use, is, as he said, quote, pharmacologically incorrect. Because if you think about blocking the keys from the locks, you run the risk of even blocking those natural endorphins that could make the problem worse. But there is, again, we're still learning. There's a small subset of the population that seems to do well on it for some reason. We still don't understand, right? But where methadone and buprenorphine sort of act as endorphin replacements, naltrexone, which the brand name of the extended release injectable version is Vivitrol, that's not an endorphin replacement, it's an endorphin blocker. Which also then, if people don't come back for a second shot, it actually can make them even more opioid naive and more subject to overdose. So I believe we need all the tools in our toolbox, right? And naltrexone should not be confused with naloxone, which is the overdose reversal drug. Let me say that as well. Two different things, and naloxone is critical to keep people alive until we can get them all the things they need or want to live a quality life. So we need all the tools in our toolbox, but it's important we understand the science sort of behind them when we're making referrals or when we're educating our community or just when we're sitting with our patients and discussing things with them. And so with that, I think I'm not going to go into, well, one thing I want to say about recovery, because I alluded to this earlier, then I'm going to go back and make sure I've answered some questions that were in the chat, which I've only got about 10 minutes left, and then maybe any others that have come in. I'm not even looking at the chat. It just keeps blinking at me, but I mean, that were asked in the app prior. And then if we have time for anything else in the chat, I'm happy to do that as well. But I want to end with this notion of recovery and remind our counselors here that there is no clinical definition of recovery. It's a patient term with varying meanings and applications. In the United States, our Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration engaged a variety of national and international recovery organizations. Pre-2011, I was one that was involved in that to really come up with what we call a working definition, meaning potentially evolving, but that every branch of the recovery community from one side to the other agreed with. And that working definition is as follows: that recovery is a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. Doesn't say anything about whether or not they work the steps, although for many people the steps help this, right? And help them improve their health and wellness, help them engage in that process of change. It's not required, right? Doesn't say anything about whether or not they do or they don't take a medication. In fact, many patients, when they start really learning this or that are in a medication-assisted treatment are surprised to learn out that it's actually the medication, when used along all those comprehensive services appropriately, is one of the greatest tools that helps them initiate this process of change. But it's not on us, it's not on clinicians or counselors to say who is or who is not in recovery. That's not our role, it's not our authority. We don't have that right? Our job is to go back to what I talked about at the beginning, those evidence-based practice, right? To improve our clinical expertise through things like this conference, right? Going to as many things like this conference as we can to look for evidence-based, peer-reviewed journals, right? Not go for single studies that match our beliefs, to continually shore up our clinical expertise, and then seek out the best clinical evidence from systematic research for whatever the topic is we're looking at, right? And then when we parlay that within that individual patient's values and preferences, then we have an evidence-based practice. That's our duty, not our duty to try to be monarch of recovery and proclaim who is and is not in or out. All right, a couple of and that's, I'm not going to go into any more of that, but I do want to kind of give me just a second. I want to get to a part that the World Health Organization talks about stigma, a quote on stigma and how it can impact patients from finding recovery. And they say the stigma associated with substance use and dependence can prevent individuals from seeking treatment and can prevent adequate policies regarding prevention and treatment from being implemented. Stigma, misinformation, not having a competent addiction recovery workforce. And so I commend everyone that's at this conference, at this workshop, and that goes to the others for striving to become competent addiction professionals, right? Because then you can shape in your province with your members, with your MPs, with your local leaders. You can get involved on committees or whatever with professional associations and help influence policy in this area away from stigma and towards the science. And not just, Canada's fairly MAT friendly overall as far as the medications, but make sure these patients have access to more than the medications, that there's a structure within your nationalized healthcare system for the reimbursement of addiction counselors that work alongside addiction medicine physicians, be that in private practice or as part of more comprehensive treatment centers. And lastly, Dr. Herman Joseph, who was the research assistant, I got to know him. He passed away a couple of years ago. I actually got to present with him at the national conference. It was one of the honors of my life. He was Drs. Dole, Niswander, and Creek, sort of the three original physicians who did the original methadone research, and then were also involved in, well, Dr. Creek anyway, who just died a few months ago, the last of them, involved in some of the buprenorphine research. Herman Joseph was their research assistant. He's a PhD. And he said this about methadone in particular, and we need to protect buprenorphine from having a similar fate. No other medication in the history of modern medicine has been so unjustly maligned. The stigma that methadone patients feel is a real phenomenon, and in comparison with other social stigmas, appears to be entrenched in the collective consciousness of society at every level. And so the stigma, not being open to the science, not meeting people where they are, espousing those non-evidence-based stigmatized view that they just have to want it bad enough without the recognition of their brain chemistry. Yes, it takes drive and participation from the patient as well. But again, the big question to always ask, is it a bad patient or bad treatment? Have they had access to all the things they need or not? Because if they haven't, don't blame the patient, blame the system, blame your policy, and what can you do to be a part of it to fix it? And so actually I'm going to stop there. And so I'm going to take this down and I'm going to try to answer. There's a few questions. So someone asked about stimulant use disorders in the app. Crystal, please interrupt me if you're still on here when I need to hush. There was stimulant use disorder question in the app. Do we have any medications for those? And at this time, we don't. There's some interesting paper that was published a couple months ago now that utilized very low dose naltrexone, which is the one I mentioned earlier that's really effective for alcohol use disorders. Very low dose naltrexone alongside an SSRI, bupropion, or also Wellbutrin, that was showing some, they've not gone through all the clinical trials yet, showing some promise there. But also they're doing some research in the United States at the National Institute on Drug Abuse right now, looking at this same sort of principle that we've realized, with opioids to be the case, where are there long-acting stimulants, long-acting, remember, because of the highs and lows of short-acting, that we could utilize in a controlled environment in a way that would allow us to sort of normalize the brain on a more consistent level and then slowly bring it down. Research is being done there, so we don't have a stimulant use yet. Dr. Mary Jean Creek, who I mentioned a bit earlier, who just recently passed away, one of the giants in this field. She worked at the Rockefeller University Biology of Addictive Diseases until her death a few months ago. The last I saw her was just before the pandemic, and this was probably October of 2019. And had dinner with her, and she's just always excited about her work all the way up till her death. And Zach, I'm working on, and she's got a New York accent. Obviously, I don't. New York City, and she'd say, I'm working on a medication, and we're on the verge of research where we're going to have a medication for stimulant use disorders, be that cocaine, methamphetamine, that people can also take safely alongside their, she says, methadone and buprenorphine, and she was so excited. And so when I contributed to an op-ed after her death, I encouraged her folks at Rockefeller to continue that and get it over the finish line. And so there's a lot of important research going on now when it comes to MAT with stimulant use disorders. Alcohol use disorders, I didn't have time to touch on today. Some great medicines there. Actually, naltrexone's taken the lead. We have some of the older ones because it doesn't make them sick. There's a really neat intervention known as Drink Yourself Sober. You might be able to Google it, where people actually start taking naltrexone orally, and they can still go out and have a drink, but they just suddenly stop wanting it over time if they take the naltrexone, but they don't get sick the way that Antabuse and some of the historical meds do, which would just drive people not to take the medicine. Right. And so it's a very interesting thing. And then, of course, we have the injectable long-acting naltrexone for alcohol use disorders. So I have a close relationship with CACCF now. I have pledged to work with Crystal and her team to try to bring more information like this to you all over the time. And we'll try to do something on alcohol use disorders in the future, as well as it parlays to medicine. But again, it's not either or, medicine or counseling. It's both and most importantly, what does each individual patient need? And what are their values and preferences? And what does the evidence show? One last thing in the act was on medication compliance. Patients, I've always said, you can't have a person who a symptom of their disease is not taking opioids as prescribed and then say, oh, by the way, here, take this one, but take this one as prescribed. It's not going to happen. We're foolish, right? And to think it will. I wouldn't have, right? I'm in some long-term care. Give me a week of methadone. Okay. Everybody would have had some. I'd have sold some for dope. That's not what we're talking about. And so we also have to deliver these medicines in a way that we lower barriers to them, but patients have a chance to see the benefit, that we have a chance to stabilize. So in our programs, and this can be done in Canada in the programs, I know that at least the on-site, I'm not sure about your pharmacy side, with methadone, because we don't do any methadone in pharmacies here. It's all comprehensive outpatient drug treatment programs that utilize them. But the patients, they come and they take it in front of my nurse every day. We do counseling at least twice a week in the beginning, unless they're totally resistant, right? And until we see progress, and then what happens is, with methadone, it takes a little longer, and it's a full agonist, right? So you have to be a little more careful. Still a great medicine. And for people with higher tolerances, especially in this era of fentanyl, it's proven more needed now than we thought. We thought buprenorphine would serve most folks when it came out, but it's not going to be the case now with fentanyl. More are going to need methadone, and that's okay if it's used properly. They're taking it every day. We can get their dose right. We check in with them. At a minimum, we're not going to do counseling every single day, right? Where the goal in outpatient is that people can get on to life. get on with life, and they can learn the coping skills and the healthy mechanisms to function in the real world. Everybody does good in rehab or jail. How do we get people to do well when they have the stressors of the real world on them? And so even if they're just touching base with a nurse or a pharmacist to take that medication at the program each day in the beginning, but ask them how they're doing. The structure of having to be somewhere, you wouldn't believe the patients that have told us how helpful that's been. And so it's important. Medication compliance is important. And from my view, induction, we have to have accessibility where that we make it easy on people to have supervised consumption of these treatment medications in the beginning. Once their drug screens prove favorable, once they've engaged in counseling, we know that we're not sending these medicines into a home environment of chaos. Then the goal is absolutely to cut down their attendance and let them have unsupervised doses of medicine. And we find that when we stabilize people appropriately, we're not just like, here's a week of Suboxone, good luck. But they come and take it, we check in with them, we give them structure, we build therapeutic rapport and alliance, we build trust. We always tell them, we're not probation or parole, we are treatment. You can be honest with us. We're not going to kick you out. If something shows up in your drug screen, to us, it's not a sign of treatment failure, it's that something's wrong. And as clinicians, we need to use that drug screen result to go back to the patient and say, hey, I see you were positive for this on this date. What was going on at that time? And we use those things as clinical tools so we can help the patient, so we can help them and figure out what's going on to try to prevent it from happening again. We don't say, oh, you failed a drug screen, you're out. It's malpractice in my view. So I do think medication compliance is important, but even once they're stable from our view and have unsupervised doses, we'll do occasional bottle recalls and things if they're on methadone or Suboxone. And remember, not everybody is, right? But for those where that's proven a useful tool, and we know that most people, based on research alone, not my opinion, take it up with evidence base that spans near 50 years now, that most folks with an OUD will need one of those two medicines incorporated, if it's used appropriately alongside comprehensive services, to have their best chance at long-term sobriety. So I hope I didn't get into too much science. I hope I did just enough to give you an overview of things that hopefully you didn't know, and things that you did know, maybe you're thinking about them in a different way. Counselors, the certification that CACCF offers is critical if we're going to address these things in an appropriate way and give patients access to everything they need, alongside things like medication, peer recovery coaching, and other things. So I don't know if there's a way, I don't know if there's any other, if we have time or if there's any other questions, I'm happy to entertain those.
You are out of time, Mr. Talbot, and we're so thankful for you and everything that you do. That was incredible. I'm hoping to bring you back for another session next year or even before that, because there's going to be a ton of questions, because you are fantastic and we appreciate your knowledge and your skills on a go forward. And I know you didn't get a chance to see the chat, but the whole chat for the first time in my experience was actually people saying thank you to you, because you brought with you a focus that we don't often have here in Canada, and you enabled us to look at the positivity of reinforcing a positive model of recovery. So thank you for your time and your expertise, and everything else that you do for everyone in this industry.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, y'all.
Pleasure to be with you from the South.
We hope you love your weather.
Yeah, well, the good comes with the bad. Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.
We'll try.